I ask you to join me in welcoming the team from the FCC.
Good afternoon. I'm Jean Kidu, Chair of the Incentive Auction Task Force at the Federal Communications Commission. The FCC recently undertook the world's first two-sided spectrum auction. Relying heavily on operations research tools, the so-called incentive auction used a market-based mechanism to reclaim much-needed spectrum to meet the exploding growth in mobile broadband and next-generation 5G wireless services. We did this by offering incentive payments to TV broadcasters to surrender spectrum that they currently use for over-the-air television broadcasting. On behalf of the FCC and our outstanding incentive auction team, it's a tremendous honor to be one of the 2018 Franz Edelman Award finalists, all of whom have achieved extraordinary results using operations research and analytics. And we're excited to be here today to tell you about our auction. Before we dive into the mechanics of the auction and the critical operations research and data analytics that made it possible, let's look at a brief tutorial on what we mean by spectrum and why Congress instructed the FCC to design this complicated two-sided auction.
Every day, more and more aspects of our daily lives depend on devices that use radio waves to transmit and receive information. From smartphones, Wi-Fi networks, and over-the-air radio and television, to garage door openers, remote controls, and baby monitors, countless devices and services require radio waves to function. The entire range of radio frequencies that can be used for such purposes is referred to as the radio frequency spectrum. The Federal Communications Commission, known as the FCC, manages these radio frequencies by allocating portions of spectrum for particular uses. The FCC prevents devices from interfering with each other by authorizing a particular spectrum use on specific frequency bands in fixed geographic areas. Spectrum is a finite resource, and there is little spectrum remaining that is suitable for the rapidly growing demand for mobile data. One way to relieve this shortage is to repurpose spectrum from an existing use to a higher value purpose. Using analytics and operations research, the FCC determined that over-the-air TV stations could be rearranged or repacked onto fewer channels, thereby using less spectrum. The recovered spectrum could then be made available for mobile broadband use. In 2012, based on these studies, Congress passed a law directing the Commission to conduct the world's first two-sided spectrum auction. The resulting incentive auction, driven by analytics and operations research, used market incentives to repurpose spectrum from over-the-air broadcast TV to mobile broadband uses.
By any measure, the auction was one of the most successful in FCC history. 175 TV stations agreed to sell their channels for a total of over $10 billion, and we were therefore able to sell 84 megahertz of valuable spectrum to wireless companies. The auction generated nearly $20 billion in revenue, $7.3 billion of which will go to reducing the federal deficit. But the dollars raised in the auction are only a fraction of its lasting benefits. The spectrum we repurposed will enable wireless carriers to increase mobile broadband coverage and deploy new next-generation 5G services. By some estimates, the deployment of this new spectrum capacity will increase productivity and stimulate the U.S. economy by many billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of jobs. When you consider the challenges of conducting this auction, these results are even more remarkable. The incentive auction broke new ground in spectrum policy in the United States and around the globe, and operations research was a core pillar of its success. Unlike all prior FCC auctions, where we knew what we were selling, here the supply was determined solely by voluntary broadcaster participation. And unlike earlier auctions, we actually had to pay for the spectrum we were selling, which meant that revenues generated from the sale of the repurposed spectrum to wireless providers had to cover our costs. On top of that, we needed to guarantee that stations remaining on the air could be accommodated without undue interference. All of these things pose daunting challenges, and we turned to operations research to solve them. Thanks again for the opportunity to tell you in more detail how operations research was essential to the design of the auction. Here to begin that story is Gary Epstein, who from 2012 until April 2017 preceded me as the chair of the Incentive Auction Task Force. Gary?
Thanks, Jean. Recognizing the need to expand broadcast internet access and speed throughout the U.S., Congress directed the FCC to develop a national broadband plan that, quote, ensures that all people of the United States have access to broadband capability and establishes benchmarks for meeting that goal, unquote. In March 2010, the FCC released Connecting America, the national broadband plan that recommended ways to make new spectrum available to meet the rising demand for mobile broadband. One proposal was to pay existing spectrum licensees market-determined incentive prices to relinquish their spectrum rights. The broadband plan stimulated industry, the FCC, and congressional discussions, which concluded that TV stations might be ideal candidates for this novel approach to spectrum reallocation. Why TV spectrum? 4 reasons. First, the upper portion of the spectrum band allocated to TV stations broadcasting is especially prime beachfront property for mobile broadband services because these frequencies travel farther, carry much data, and penetrate walls, trees, and other objects. Second, the spectrum is contiguous with spectrum already allocated for mobile broadband in the 700 megahertz band. Third, over-the-air TV viewership was small relative to cable and satellite TV viewership, suggesting that broadcasters might be willing to relinquish their spectrum in return for a share of auction proceeds. Fourth, the 2009 transition of TV stations from analog to digital transmission made it possible for more than one TV station to share a single 6 megahertz channel. This meant that a station could give up its channel and continue the broadcast by sharing the channel with another TV station. Here's Meredith Baker, a former FCC commissioner and now president and CEO of CTIA, an association representing the U.S. wireless communications industry.
While the U.S. was the first to sell government spectrum, we were out of bands to sell. Meanwhile, the wireless industry and data were taking off. Remember, this is when the iPhone was created. I was on the commission, and we knew that we needed to develop a new, innovative solution. The FCC's great team answered that call. The team proposed a 2-sided auction where the FCC would buy broadcast spectrum and in the same auction, sell spectrum to the wireless industry. Buy, sell, in the same auction. An approach that had never been done before. The credit goes to the FCC's operation research team. They solved the puzzle of how to repack thousands of broadcasters into new TV stations.
Although the FCC favored this new kind of auction for repurposing spectrum, it lacked the authority from Congress to conduct it. Our operations research team and their studies performed at the FCC were used to demonstrate to Congress that repurposing broadcast spectrum was a viable and market-based solution. These studies helped to support a bipartisan consensus, and in 2012, Congress authorized the FCC to conduct a 2-sided incentive auction to reallocate spectrum in the 600 megahertz band from over-the-air television to wireless services. The FCC and Congress also recognized that repurposing broadcast spectrum relinquished by winning broadcasters would result in wireless spectrum scattered throughout the band. This would not result in the contiguous blocks of clear spectrum needed for wireless services. Congress therefore also authorized the FCC to relocate or repack broadcasters who remained on the air by moving them to an equivalent channel in the smaller contiguous band of spectrum still allocated for television services. This is another place where operations research came to the rescue of the auction. This diagram of the 600 megahertz band before and after the incentive auction is a simplified illustration of what we needed to achieve. At the top of the diagram, we see the pre-auction 600 megahertz band, and to the right of it, the beginning of the 700 band, which is used for wireless service. The lower portion of the diagram shows what the auction accomplished. The before diagram shows that TV channels take up the entire 600 megahertz band. In the after diagram, the spectrum located to the right is now allocated for uplink and downlink wireless use. To the left is the new smaller TV band, in which TV broadcasters that did not relinquish their spectrum rights are in the process of being repacked and will continue the broadcast. Our challenge was to design an auction that would get us from the pre-auction band to the post-auction result. Here is what happened.
How does the incentive auction work? First, a reverse auction determines how much it will cost to repurpose a given amount of spectrum previously licensed to television stations. TV stations are offered money to vacate their spectrum. Stations that do not sell are guaranteed a channel in their current frequency band. The reverse auction starts with high prices offered to TV stations. If more stations accept these prices than needed to clear the specified amount of spectrum, prices decrease. As prices drop, some stations will reject the prices offered and join the set of stations that will remain on the air. If no spectrum is available for a station, the price offered to the station stops decreasing. The auction continues until there is no spectrum left for any of the stations accepting the prices. This establishes the amount of money needed to clear the spectrum. Next, the same amount of spectrum is offered in a forward auction to wireless carriers. In the forward auction, prices start low and rise until the amount of spectrum for which there are bids equals the available supply. If the amount bid by wireless providers is not enough to pay the broadcasters, then the auction continues to a new stage, in which both the reverse and forward auctions are repeated starting where they left off. In each succeeding stage, the FCC designates a smaller amount of spectrum to be sold to wireless carriers, and therefore needs to buy fewer channels from TV stations. Because this frees up more space for TV stations, competition among TV broadcasters makes their prices go down. And then in the forward auction, less wireless spectrum for sale means more competition among wireless bidders, which increases the price of the spectrum. The incentive auction continues through as many stages as are necessary for money bid by wireless providers to pay the selling TV broadcasters. At that point, supply and demand are in balance and the auction ends.
Hi, I'm Sasha Javid. I was Chief Data Officer for the Incentive Auction Task Force. This complicated auction required operations research in every step. This diagram is a simplified representation of the auction process. Nearly every one of those boxes required operations research and analytics to be successful. Today, we want to just focus on some of the core auction mechanisms. I will discuss feasibility checking required at every round of the reverse auction. Dr. Carla Hoffman will then discuss two of the other optimizations used in the auction. Overarching all of this work was the need to be able to repack stations into a smaller swath of spectrum in a manner that preserved their current coverage. It determined everything from how much spectrum would be auctioned to which TV stations would see their price offers decrease during the reverse auction. Let's start at a 30,000-foot view on the elements of repacking.
In a standard auction, the items being sold are the same as the items being bought. But in this auction, the process was not that simple. Stations were spread out across the band and needed to be reassigned or repacked to use less spectrum. How much less was unknown until stations indicated their willingness to participate. This is why repacking was critical to the auction. Creating new channel assignments was not easy. Nearby TV stations interfere with each other if assigned the same or an adjacent channel. TV stations broadcast from specific towers and have their own individual coverage areas. Although the FCC could assign a TV station to any channel in the band, it could not move the station to a different physical location, nor could it change its coverage area. The auction therefore required algorithms that could determine, for any set of TV stations, whether there was a channel assignment for each station that would allow all stations to reach their existing viewers from their existing facilities. And since the set of stations needing to be assigned changed each round, and the channels available also changed each stage, the procedure had to do this calculation repeatedly and quickly. Creating new channel assignments for nearly 3,000 stations onto a limited set of channels required the FCC to use state-of-the-art computing and mathematical methods. Analytics and operations research provided the necessary tools.
So, as the video highlighted, we needed to ensure that stations remain on the air, would continue to receive their existing viewers after they move to the post-auction channel. When two stations operate on the same channel or adjacent channels, their signals can interfere and therefore prevent viewers from receiving signals from either station. To avoid excessive interference between two stations, the FCC used custom software to determine the existing service area for each station on a 2x2 kilometer cell level, and then repeated this study on every channel. In the graphic, you can see all the cells that receive the signal for a station that's near Washington, D.C. We then determined whether there was any new interference between the stations when the two stations were assigned to the same or adjacent channels. The operations research team then translated these physics-based interference calculations into constraints that could be used both within the optimization and feasibility checking routines. As you might imagine, stations rarely operate in isolation and often broadcast from the same mountaintop or tower or even the same antenna. This created over 2.5 million pairwise restrictions on feasible assignments. These restrictions prevented two stations from being assigned to channels where either station would receive excessive interference. Another challenge in reallocating spectrum is that it does not respect international borders. Unless Canadian and Mexican stations also move to channels in the same reduced TV band, substantial portions of cities close to the border would have little or no 600 megahertz spectrum usable for mobile broadband. The FCC therefore engaged its counterparts in Canada and Mexico to demonstrate the value of clearing spectrum together to create a uniform 600 megahertz band plan. Scenario modeling enabled by operations research provided the FCC with the data to inform regulators in both countries and convinced the FCC and the Canadian regulators to proceed in an unprecedented joint repack. The benefits of a joint repack were clear, but the addition of almost 800 Canadian stations to the repacking problem was far from trivial, especially since certain Canadian requirements had to be respected. These additional constraints were incorporated into operations research tools used in the various components of the auction. With the ability to model interference for all TV stations throughout North America, the next important challenge was to be able to determine within the descending price clock auction which stations receive reduced price offers because it was feasible for them to be repacked in the remaining TV band. Many feasibility checks were therefore needed between stations in each round to determine whether each active station could feasibly be repacked along with all exited stations. If so, that station would be offered a lower price in the next round. If the feasibility check determined that a station could not be repacked, the station's price stopped descending, and if the auction ended this stage, the station would receive its last accepted price. For the auction to work, these feasibility checks had to happen quickly, or the auction would never end. The problem was to determine in a very short time if there's an assignment of channels to a set of stations that satisfies all interference constraints. We enlisted the help of Dr. Kevin Leighton-Brown and his team from the University of British Columbia to tackle this problem. They explored using both off-the-shelf mixed integer programming solvers as well as a variety of open-source satisfiability solvers. The SAT solvers, which were specifically designed to solve these kinds of problems, of feasibility problems, proved to be faster than the others, but not nearly fast enough. Without tuning, even the SAT solvers would require close to 100 seconds to determine the feasibility of 80% of the problems. This was too long. We could afford some timeouts and assume the problem isn't feasible, but any false infeasibility increased auction costs and reduced the likelihood of repurposing the highest possible amount of spectrum. To solve this problem, the team from UBC created the SAT-FC, which really is just a portfolio of different satisfiability solvers, but with different configurations to get the best overall performance. The team configured the system using a technique they refer to as deep optimization. Deep optimization relied on machine learning techniques on thousands of test problems to pick the best solvers and the best configurations for these solvers. During testing, the SAT-FC was able to solve approximately 95% of the problems in under 10 seconds. Some additional techniques were used to speed up the solving even more. These included using local search routines and a caching scheme where the feasibility of certain sets of stations were solved in advance. One final enhancement was to determine prior to each stage of the auction the set of stations that would have a channel assignment regardless of who participated. Any such station was labeled as unconstrained and could be removed from the problem and assigned at the end of the auction. SATFC surpassed expectations. This auction required more than 100,000 feasibility checks to be solved via the SATFC during the auction. The overwhelming majority were solved in seconds or just fractions of a second. This performance was critical to the success of the auction. Its performance enabled the FCC to complete up to 6 rounds a day with minimal impact to the cost of clearing the stations. Now I'd like to turn to Dr. Carla Hoffman to discuss the role of optimization in the auction.
Thanks, Sasha. I'm Carla Hoffman from George Mason University. I am part of the optimization team at the FCC, which includes colleagues from NCI as well as Mike Trick from Carnegie Mellon Qatar. Although there were many optimization problems that needed solving during both the auction design phase and during the auction itself, I want to highlight 2 optimization problems that were critical to the overall success of the auction. The first was determining the clearing target, and the second, determining the channel assignments for TV stations that remained on the air after the auction. Both of these problems needed special purpose algorithms since commercial codes were incapable of solving these problems in acceptable times. Let me begin by discussing the clearing target optimization. The auction's goal was to repurpose as much spectrum as possible nationwide. Thus, the optimizations needed to determine where to designate the line between the TV stations so that the maximum amount of spectrum could be repurposed given TV participation. The FCC was presented with a choice: either limit the amount of spectrum repurposed nationwide to the amount made available in the most constrained market, or allow some stations to be assigned channels in the new wireless services band. The FCC chose the latter, opting to permit some level of interference from TV stations to a few wireless licenses. The auction itself would then determine the value of the impaired spectrum. A clearing target would not be chosen if that target's total impairments exceeded a specified threshold. The FCC needed to quantify the potential interference between the wireless and broadcast transmissions. This was done by evaluating each station on each possible channel within every 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer cell nationwide, to determine whether interference occurred between any of the wireless or TV broadcasting services. The interference extends far beyond the station's coverage area. As you can see, the interference from this Washington station extends all the way up to New York and down to Raleigh, North Carolina. We needed to aggregate the terabytes of data into usable constraints that accurately measure any interference between wireless and TV broadcasters. For example, in just one clearing target, we need to capture over 3 billion potential points of interference. Since TV stations were guaranteed no new interference, the assignment of a TV station to the wireless band would mean that the holder of an impaired license could not use portions of its licensed spectrum. Over 6 million additional constraints were required to capture the interference to wireless licenses caused by protecting all TV stations assigned to the wireless band. Therefore, the primary objective of the optimization was to minimize the total impaired population weighted by the value of the market in previous auctions. A secondary objective was to maximize the number of licenses that had little or no impairment. little to no impairment. These optimizations created the best wireless licenses possible while minimizing the effects of stations being assigned to the wireless band in the most constrained markets. The complex objective function, coupled with the enormous number of constraints, resulted in a problem that the best commercial codes could not come close to solving, even given weeks of computing time. New formulations, decompositions, and heuristics were essential. One of the most important solution strategies was to rewrite the pairwise constraints into appropriate clique constraints. These specially selected cliques resulted in a reduction from over 8 million constraints to approximately 700,000, and a significantly tighter formulation. But even with this reformulation, the best commercial codes were incapable of finding good solutions. Our solution was to use large neighborhood search. This technique requires fixing all but a neighborhood of variables to a known solution, and then having the solver provide optimal solutions to this much smaller problem. Repeatedly solving these smaller problems resulted in very good feasible solutions. Similarly, we implemented a Bender's decomposition approach to obtain better lower bounds. The master problem determined assignments to the wireless band, and subproblems determined the region where the master problem assignment was infeasible. Cuts were added to the master problem requiring stations to be assigned to the wireless band. These cuts forced the optimization to accurately reflect the cost of impairment in the most congested geographic regions. During the auction, the feasibility checker guaranteed that all TV stations remaining after the auction could be assigned to channel. The goal of the final channel assignment was to find the best assignment among all feasible assignments. The main objective of this optimization was to maximize the number of stations that could continue to broadcast on their current television channel. Additionally, we needed to minimize new interference and wanted to avoid moving stations whose move would be exceptionally difficult and/or expensive. The objective of assigning stations to their original channel, especially the stations whose moves would be most difficult, had two positive consequences. First, it would reduce the total resources for transitioning to new channel assignments. And second, it would reduce the time needed for the overall transition. As this picture illustrates, climbing towers as high as 2,000 feet can be both expensive and dangerous. So the fewer such moves, the better. To solve these problems, we again used large neighborhood search techniques and a Bender's decomposition. Finally, for all of the optimizations performed, the FCC created its own distributed solver system by which any results obtained from one processor could be shared with the other processors. This methodology allowed all the heuristics and decomposition methods to share information such as new solutions and better bounds across multiple machines. Custom profiles for each optimization approach specified the number of servers used and the parameters to use on each server. At its peak, over 70 extra-large AWS cloud servers were employed. Gurobi 6.5 was the optimization engine used. Combining these techniques reduced the gap on the hardest problems significantly, often proving optimality to previously unsolvable problems. The ability to find good solutions quickly also helped to inform much of the auction policy-making process. The clearing target optimization procedures solved all problems to proven optimality. Identifying an assignment with minimum impairments allowed the auction to start at the highest possible clearing target of 126 megahertz. The value of this result cannot be overstated. A higher possible target meant that more TV stations would need to be purchased, increasing the possibility of high payouts to TV stations. Also, increasing the number of interference-free licenses meant wireless providers would be willing to pay more for this clean spectrum. Similarly, the results of the final channel assignment also exceeded expectations. The final channel assignment permitted 1,700 stations to stay on their original channels, of the roughly 2,200 stations remaining on the air whose original channel was still available. Aggregate interference was kept below 1.1% for all stations, with only 12 stations nationwide receiving aggregate interference of more than 1%. Now that we've explained some of the operations research techniques used to make the auction possible, we'll turn it back to Jean to tell you a little bit more about the auction results and the benefits.
Thank you, Carla. I hope that you are all as impressed as I am every time I think about what our operations research team accomplished. Before we turn to the auction's direct and indirect benefits, however, I wanted to note that as a federal governmental agency, all of the complexities, including model formulations and the solutions that Sasha and Carla described, had to be painstakingly explained to companies on all sides of the industry, many of whom were highly skeptical that the FCC could pull off an auction of this level of complexity, and who were given an opportunity to comment on all aspects of the auction design. This transparent process helped us to test and validate our assumptions and processes. The data-driven auction design parameters also had to be understood and trusted to be reliable by the FCC commissioners who were responsible for adopting them. Here's FCC Commissioner Mignon Clyburn, who served as acting chairwoman during part of the time that the rules were being developed.
The Incentive Auction Task Force explained these tools in a way that less technical audiences could understand them and more knowledgeable stakeholders could provide thoughtful, detailed comments about them. All parties were able to develop confidence in the Commission's decision-making, which is why the incentive auction was such a success.
So now let me turn to the benefits of all this effort. To recap what I told you at the outset, the incentive auction's primary goal was to free up as much spectrum as the market would yield, and that we did. Using operations research, the Commission repurposed 84 megahertz of unimpaired spectrum for wireless use at market-determined prices and with voluntary participation by both broadcasters and wireless companies. The result was the largest amount of low-band spectrum ever offered on a nationwide basis in an FCC auction. Measured purely in terms of revenues, the incentive auction was the second largest in FCC history, grossing $19.8 billion in gross revenues in the forward auction. Of those revenues, I'm pleased to say that $7.3 billion will go toward federal deficit reduction, more than $10 billion to winning broadcast bidders, and $1.75 billion to reimburse the costs of TV stations needing to move to new channels. In addition, over 130 of the 175 winning TV stations will likely continue broadcasting after the auction, most by sharing channels with other local TV stations. This means that viewer access to most TV content will remain the same, and that much of the $10 billion in reverse auction winnings may remain in the industry to be reinvested by stations into new content and capital improvements. Several non-commercial public broadcasting stations said that the auction provided vital endowments for their stations for generations to come. And last month, we learned that a Rhode Island PBS station is using its auction proceeds to establish a scholarship for local high school seniors interested in studying journalism. But the auction was not about raising revenues. It was about making critical spectrum available to meet the demand of American consumers. Deploying that spectrum across the length and breadth of the country will create jobs, CTIA, the Wireless Industry Association, reports that the wireless industry invested more than $26 billion in network infrastructure in 2016, and the deployment of the new 600 megahertz spectrum will help to fully employ the industry for several more years at least. For example, T-Mobile, the largest wireless auction winner, has stated that it intends to use its new spectrum to build the first nationwide 5G network. And it's already started to deploy its new spectrum to expand and improve its existing mobile broadband networks, particularly to rural areas. It has become abundantly clear that increasing wireless capacity spurs economic growth. The new app economy developed only after spectrum became available for the new 3G broadband networks needed to power smartphones. It currently accounts for 1.72 million jobs and is predicted to exceed 6.3, these numbers are so big, $6.3 trillion in economic activity by 2021. Getting the repurposed 600 megahertz spectrum out to the industry will continue to fuel this new segment of the economy and will also allow the United States to be at the forefront of the new 5G technology that will power the Internet of Things and all types of new services now being developed. The Commission's coordination with Canada and Mexico has also ensured that U.S. carriers and device manufacturers will enjoy the economies of scale of a consistent spectrum band throughout the United States, Canada, and Mexico. I'm also pleased to report that current and former congressional leadership on both sides of the aisle were more than satisfied with the auction's outcomes and how the Commission discharged its duties under the Spectrum Act. At the close of the auction, 4 senior members of Congress, 2 from each party, said, "The broadcast incentive auction revolutionized the way that our nation makes spectrum allocation decisions by empowering broadcasters, businesses, networks, and consumers alike." The FCC also turned to operations research to address the post-auction repack challenge of how to expeditiously transition the roughly 1,000 U.S. TV stations and 170 Canadian stations that were assigned to new channels in the new TV band. The operations research techniques developed for the FCC for this auction have given spectrum regulators around the globe a new spectrum management tool. Numerous foreign regulators have sought FCC input on how they could apply incentive auction techniques to clear spectrum for mobile broadband use. The FCC is also looking at ways that operations research techniques and two-sided auction structures might be applied to other spectrum bands, such as the satellite bands, to ensure that they're also being efficiently used. The FCC has also recognized the value of operations research to guide other policy decisions in addition to spectrum auction design. As you'll hear in just a minute, the Commission has just created a new office specifically charged with integrating data analytics with policymaking. As part of that initiative, we will also establish new Chief Data Officer and Chief Data Scientist positions to ensure that the latest data analytics and operations research techniques are brought to bear in FCC proceedings at the highest levels of the Commission. FCC Chairman Ajit Pai proposed the Office of Economics and Analytics, in part because of the incentive auction success, and we'll let him have the last word.
The dynamic communications and technology sector represents about 1/6 of the overall U.S. economy. The choices the FCC makes can have a major impact on this vital driver of American job creation and growth. That's why it is so important that we apply rigorous data and economic analysis when we make decisions. The incentive auction is a case in point. The auction simply would not have been possible without the use of operations research tools that helped us solve complicated design and implementation challenges. The success of these tools speaks for itself, and the team's work is a good example of the data-driven approach to policymaking that I believe should be this agency's hallmark. Based in part on this model, I proposed, and the FCC voted to establish, an Office of Economics and Analytics. This new office will aim, in part, to ensure that data analytics isn't an afterthought at the FCC. The office will build upon the outstanding analytics capabilities we relied on in the incentive auction as a resource to inform our decision-making. The American people will be the beneficiaries for years to come.
So, not only did the incentive auction make prime beachfront spectrum available for critical mobile capacity, it also created an important beachhead for advanced data analytics to play an important role in all aspects of FCC policymaking into the future. Thank you very much, and we would be happy to take your questions.